for that. Hopefully just some talking points, for you and your clients, for the ones that are sitting on the fence a little bit, good visual, easy stuff to make too. We could probably make a few of those, send them out if you guys, want, some stuff to share on your social media to show equity growth. 3% is very, very reasonable. I mean, that's year over year, even when in the down market, a couple of years ago, we were still appreciating 3%. So, all right, I am going to share my screen. Okay, so for those of you just jumping on, we're going over defensible space resources today, also known AB 38, deals with defensible space. We're going to review the FHDS form. This form I have the most questions on right now, and needing to explain it and go through it and things like that. This one's probably, I don't know if it's the toughest one, but it is a little difficult to read it. And what you're supposed to be doing with it. So we're going to review that one. We'll fill one out. Again, if you have questions as we're going through those or any part of this presentation, just throw them in the chat, and I will answer those as we go. And then we'll briefly touch on the fire insurance contingency in the RPA. So first, we'll just start with defensible space. What is that? If you don't know by now, this is the buffer zone that homeowners create between a structure on the property and any flammable grass, trees, shrubs, or wildland area that surround it. There are state and local laws that require certain property owners to maintain defensible space on their property. If you're in one of those areas that has local ordinances, you probably know about it just with your own property. But locals do have, or some local ordinances do vary from the state. So defensible space is a name for 100-foot area that owners of properties located in fire zones must maintain around structures on their property. Creating and maintaining defensible space is important to slow the spread of wildfires and reduce the likelihood that the structure will catch fire. It also is important for protecting firefighters who may be on property defending the structure. So defensible space is composed between two zones. Zone 1, which extends 30 feet, although some localities could extend it further from buildings and other properties. So we'll look at that. Zone 1 and what they require. So if you are heading to a listing appointment or you are showing a property, make a mental note of what you're looking at here if you believe you're going to be in a high fire area, or if you've already taken a look, or if you're looking on your phone. I mean, you can look mobilely too, and I'm going to share those resources with you if this property is in fact in a high or very high fire zone. So zone 1, they're going to require remove all dead plants, grass, weeds. So this is the 30-foot area around the structure. Dead and dry leaves, branches hanging over the roof. That's pretty common. Trimming trees regularly with branches at a minimum of 10 feet from other trees. Relocating wood piles. That's probably not a huge thing these days. Remove or prune flammable plants. Remove vegetation items that could catch fire from around or under decks. So if you're maybe on a hillside and you have a lot of vegetation underneath it, a nice view deck or something, look for that kind of stuff. Create a separation between trees and shrubs. So zone 2 extends 100 feet. So you have the 30-foot zone, basically immediately around the house, and then you have probably more along, property lines, 100 feet around the house. Property owners must do the following things within zone 2, which is cut or mow annual grass down to a maximum of 4 inches, create horizontal space between trees and shrubs, create vertical space between grass, shrubs, and trees, remove fallen trees, needles, twigs, bark, cones, all that kind of stuff. What that looks like, I can show you on this space right here. This is a good link to save, have on your phone. I don't know. But you want to have this link accessible if you are, actively showing houses or even going into a listing appointment and explaining to a homeowner who is in a high fire area, look, these are the things that you're probably going to need to do. And this is what that looks like. So we're talking about zone 1. So you have the structure. So this is the 30-foot zone around the house. And then there's all kinds of resources and things on here that you can look at. But, if you're kind of looking at a house and it's in high vegetation area, this is that 30-foot zone that they're wanting it to be cleared out. So this is a good example of kind of what that would look like. So if you're showing a house that is in a high fire area and it doesn't really look like that, you're probably going to run into some issues with the fire line during or the zones during escrow. Someone's going to need to take care of that. Sellers in areas covered by the law either need to provide documentation that their property complies with defensible space laws, or the buyers must agree to obtain such documentation of compliance in the future. So, like I said, someone's going to need to take care of that. So if you're there and it looks like, this home hasn't been maintaining their defensible space, and maybe the seller does not want to do anything or doesn't have the ability to do anything to clean that up and make it compliant, then that's going to fall onto the buyer, and the buyer's going to need to know that. And that's what the FHDS form is actually for, is the home affected? And if so, who's going to remedy it? Or is there a cert on file already? So what does this law apply to? Sales of residential 1 to 4s, condominiums or other common interest developments, or manufactured homes, where the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and when a TDS is required. So there are some TDS exempt properties out there. So it's going to need to be these 3 things right here. There are essentially 4 ways to comply with this law. So areas without local ordinance requiring an owner to obtain documentation of compliance with defensible space laws. Either the buyer must agree to obtain documentation of compliance within 1 year after closing escrow, or if the seller has obtained documentation of compliance within 6 months prior to entering into contract, the seller must provide that documentation to the buyer and provide information on the local agency from which a copy of the documentation may be obtained. Usually that's the local fire department. For areas that have enacted a local ordinance requiring an owner to obtain documentation that the property complies, either the buyer must agree to comply with the requirements of local ordinance if the ordinance allows the buyer to do so, or the seller shall provide the buyer with a copy of the documentation that complies with the requirements of that local ordinance and information on the local agency, which a copy of that documentation is obtained. So it's like a certificate basically that you get. To comply with the legal obligation, sellers should use the form fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. That is the FHDS form we're going to be reviewing. In this form, the parties must agree how documentation of defensible space compliance will be obtained. The FHDS form lays out 6 options for the parties to indicate how they will be complying with this law. This requirement is part of the same law that requires sellers to provide the TDS. So this is an important one. This has to be done, recorded, and in our file as well, in the transaction file. Consequently, the defensible space compliance law has the same exemptions and cancellation rights as the TDS law in general. So how can you find out if the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone? We do have this link in the back office. If you look in the online office and the transactional needs section, it says AB38. Defensible space. I have all these resources here for you that you can always find. So if you're not going to bookmark it on your computer or phone, you can always go to the online office and pull up this information as well. Otherwise, if you want to research one, hopefully you can still see my screen. You will click this link. This is fire hazard severity zones. Now you can scroll down here and they have an interactive map. And basically you can punch in an address here and it's going to let you know if it's in a high fire area or not. So, I mean, let's just zoom in here to like the Temecula Valley area. You'll see there is a lot of red out there. There's a lot of homes affected by this. Pretty much everywhere you go in California, there is going to be red zones. This means that the chances that the homeowner is going to need to have fire insurance on their property is pretty high. More than likely, they're going to need it. And more than likely, they're going to have a challenge finding this fire insurance, and they may have to go with the California FAIR Plan. If they have to go with the California FAIR Plan, give yourself an extra week on that. Don't do that right up to close of escrow. Do that sooner because that does take a little while to get in place. It's longer than getting just a regular insurance binder. So this is where you will find it out. So let's say you're going to be showing a property and you're in a high fire area generally, or you think you're going to be getting into a high fire area. You might want to just double check and let the buyer know that, hey, this one's going to require fire insurance. They may or may not want to see it after that. So use this tool when you're going on your listing appointments to determine if the seller is going to need to take care of some stuff as you walk the property, or for your buyer clients to let them know that they are going to need fire insurance, or the chances are very, very high. I mean, this is a pretty accurate map here. So this is a great resource. I actually use this quite often just to double check on things. So let's go back. Now, zoom back out. All right. So went through that. So there's your resources. Another resource, this is more if you're already in escrow. Here's a snapshot of the new NHD layout. So if you remember, last year I did a 2024 laws update that you need to know webinar. This was one of them, the updating of the NHD to reflect the fire laws. So right here says high fire in a state responsibility area. This property is a no. Very high fire, state responsibility, no. Very high local responsibility, no. So if this was yes, then you know that's going to be a local ordinance that needs to be complied with. Otherwise, the yes would be here on the state responsibility, and then you'll need to just revert to what the state requirements are. And this is going to be high or very high. So if any of these are checked yes right here, you're going to need the FHDS form to be completed. If you're on the buying side and you are not receiving this from the listing side, do not release a contingency until you receive the FHDS form, because it needs to, we need to see who is responsible for taking care of the defensible space, because the liability could fall on your buyer, post closing, and then you're going to get a call and you don't want that. So this is where you're going to find, and this is where we look when we're doing files as well. If I see, or Anahid sees a yes in this section here, the FHDS has to be filled out, unless it's exempt, which there's not a lot of them exempt, but we should still get this in the file. If the property is designated to be in a high or very high fire zone, transaction file will require FHDS and the WFDA, which is a wildfire disclosure advisory, signed by both parties. AB 38 defensible space certification. So if the seller has a certification or is getting a certification during escrow, we will need that on the file. And again, we're going to look at the FHDS form which here is a snip here. I'm going to go over to the form live and we'll fill one out. We want to see who is taking care of it. If it says the seller is taking care of it, we're going to need that certificate on file in the transaction file. If it says that the buyer is going to be responsible, and obviously we don't have a certificate, that's not going to be required in the file. So, but these are some of the, you know, the 6 ways that it talked about of how this can be handled between buyers and sellers. How does a buyer or seller determine whether there is such an ordinance? They can contact their local fire marshal. They can contact CAL FIRE. Again, they can go to this link here. Contact your natural hazard disclosure company representative. They can speak with an attorney. You know, if you're going to list this property, maybe you want to get the NHD a little sooner than later, and just double check if you're going to need the FHDS form filled out or not. We'll go through a couple things and then we will fill out this form. So should agents or brokers offer advice to the seller or buyer to determine whether the property is subject to a local ordinance required defensible space compliance? So we're not responsible for, you know, poring over obscure local laws to figure out their meaning. Doing so may constitute an unauthorized practice of law. So we want to advise them that it may or may not be subject to the local ordinance, and then we can provide them resources. That would be probably the best course of action. Again, and that would be, you know, these right here, direct them to the local fire marshal, direct them to this website here, get an NHD report. Now, we clearly have knowledge of laws affecting real estate. In some cases, these ordinances are well known. Local escrow officers, brokers at large, local associations may be familiar with these laws, especially if you're maybe in a mountainous region or something like that, that really just pretty much all the properties are in high fire. You know, then more than likely the agents in the area and, you know, the industry professionals know what's going on up there. So this is, it is this type of industry knowledge that agents, brokers may have at their disposal and may utilize. Most importantly, the seller needs to know the highly unlikely but possible existence of a local ordinance requiring the documentation of compliance as a point of sale requirement, meaning that it must be obtained in connection with closing escrow on the property. So again, you're at the property, you're doing your listing appointment, you're walking around. It appears to be, or you already did your preliminary research on the CAL FIRE site, says it's in a high fire area. This is something you're going to need to talk to them about and clearing out at least that 30-foot area, and then looking at that 100-foot area as well. Often a local escrow officer is a good source of information on local point of sale requirements. There's lots of other point of sale requirements as well. So this is a big one that we're dealing with now. If a broker did not want to offer advice to a buyer or seller regarding the local ordinance defensible space, how can that be done? C.A.R forms allow for this, especially the form FHDS, when used in conjunction with the defensible space decision tree. So that's DSDT. Sometimes that's provided to the seller to allow them to read that and then fill out the FHDS form accordingly based on that decision tree. I kind of think that decision tree is about as confusing as the form itself, but if you don't, you know, if you want to put it on them to figure it out and not offer the advice of whether it is or isn't in the high fire, or if their property is subject to local ordinances, then give them the DSDT, and that can help them. Quick thing about fire insurance. You don't know by now, there's no specific fire insurance contingency in the residential purchase agreement. It's built into the investigations contingency, but it's not a separate contingency like a loan or an appraisal contingency. It's part of the investigations contingency, which has many different smaller contingencies kind of built into the investigations contingency. So if you haven't researched or the buyer hasn't researched if the property is going to be in a high or very high fire area, you're in escrow, have them look into this ASAP before they release the investigations contingency. Or if you're putting in a non-contingent offer, you want to check this first because you don't want to get into escrow on a non-contingent offer where you've already released the investigations contingency and find out that they are going to be required to have fire insurance, and now it's 3 times, 4 times the amount they were expecting on the insurance. So keep that in mind. You know, I know we all get excited when we have a client, we're writing an offer and things like that, but if it's non-contingent and you're, you know, working this thing fast to try and get your offer in fast, still it is our job to do, you know, this part and advise them that, hey, this property is in a high fire area. You need to know that you will probably be subject to fire insurance. You may have to go with the state fund if you can't find, you know, one of the insurance companies to insure you out there. And the price is going to be a lot more. So you want to maybe call up your insurance agent real quick and see what that looks like before we submit this non-contingent offer. So that kind of covers the fire insurance. I have this other stuff in here too. There's a resource in here for defensible space laws. If you want a copy of this presentation, I'll put it in the recording in the Facebook group so we can take a look at it. But otherwise, let's go ahead and look at the FHDS. So hopefully everybody can still see my screen. If you can't, just throw it into chat and I'll, I don't know. I think everybody can see it right now. So again, if you have questions on this, throw them into chat. We'll answer as we go. Looking at the FHDS form here, let's see how this lays out. So generally, this is going to be part of the purchase agreement, so you can just leave that as default. Dated, this is the date of when the contract was accepted. You're going to have the property address here. You're going to have the buyer's name. You're going to have the seller's name. So we'll do section 1 right here. If this property does not meet the conditions stated in paragraph 1A, which is right here, or 1B, which is right here, there is no requirement to complete the subsequent applicable paragraphs. So if it does not apply, basically all the seller is going to do is sign this form because it doesn't apply. So look at 1A, home fire hardening disclosure. The notice and disclosure of the vulnerabilities in paragraph 2 are only required for sellers of residential properties if the property contains 1 to 4 units. So a 5-unit or larger apartment building does not qualify for this. Commercial property, mixed use probably does not apply for this. We're looking at residential 1 to 4s. The seller is required to complete a TDS disclosure, which most properties do require the transfer disclosure statement. So those are the first 2 requirements. The property is located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. How do we know that? Well, we've already looked at the map. We've determined that the property falls within the red. And so we are going to be filling this out, or we have an NHD on file already, and it says yes to those check boxes if it's in a high or very high zone. So if it meets all 3 of these, 1 to 4 unit, TDS is required, it's in a high or very high fire severity zone, then and the improvements on the property were constructed before January of 2010. So if all 4 of those conditions are met, then you have to fill this out. If all four are not met, so it says if any of these four conditions is not met, seller does not have to answer the questions in paragraph 2B. So this is the questions down here. We got 6 of them. So if any of those 4 is not met, they don't have to fill this out. They're just going to sign it. Looks like we got one in chat. Oh, you don't see the form? That's let me double check here. Okay. Hopefully you can see the form now. So sorry about that. So I was reading section 1A here. This is where you find the 4 things that need to qualify, all 4, in order to know if this form needs to be completed or not. If any of these 4 things in 1A, if the property does not meet any of those, then they don't have to fill this out. 1B, defensible space compliance. The disclosures and requirements specified in paragraph 3, which is down here, are only required for sellers of residential properties if the property is 1 to 4, the TDS is required, the property is located high or very high. If any of these 3 conditions is not met, paragraph 3 does not have to be completed. So 1A and B, you're just asking yourself these questions. Does the property fall into these guidelines right here? If so, and it meets all of them, then I have to fill out section 2 here. So let's say, the property did not meet one of these requirements. Then they're going to be filling this out. And again, this is to the best of their knowledge. The seller may or may not know. But they're saying in 2B right here, are you, the seller, aware of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire or flying embers? So again, are they aware of it? They may or may not know, but they still have to fill the form out. So it could be no's, it could be yeses and no's. Again, this is just the disclosure. Section 3 here, we have defensible space disclosure and addendum. Paragraph 3 is only required to be completed if all 3 conditions for paragraph B or 1B are met. So we're talking about this section right here. The defensible space decision tree may be consulted for additional information on how to complete this paragraph. So 3A, and again, the NHD now lets us know if local or state requirements are in place for that particular property. So local compliance requirements, the property is not subject to a local vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space around the property. The NHD is going to be your best resource for this. So you're going to want to get that in place before you maybe go and have all these disclosures signed, because that will help with determining or allowing the homeowner to determine if it's a local compliance requirement. 3B, seller representation of property compliance with the applicable state defensible space requirement or local vegetation management ordinance, hereafter state or local defensible law at the time of seller signature. So the seller is going to say, seller is unaware of whether the property is in compliance with the applicable state or local defense law. Seller does not have a report prepared. I would imagine that this is going to be the bulk of your seller clients. So what happens then? It's going to be 1 or 2, or the property is in compliance. So maybe they've received notices from the city previously, and they've already taken care of it, and they have a certification. So if they have a certification stating that the property is in compliance, then they're going to check this box here. Property is in compliance with state or local defensible space law, whichever is applicable. If only state law applies, seller must have obtained compliance within the last 6 months. Seller shall deliver to buyer documentation of compliance within 3 days after seller's execution of FHDS. So if they are filling this out, they do have a certificate. They need to supply that certificate within 3 days after filling this out and sending it over to the buyer. The next option is option 3. Maybe the seller received a notice from the city and they know it's not in compliance. They have not done anything about it. Then they are going to check this box here. Property is not in compliance with state or local defensible space law, whichever is applicable. If seller has or agrees to obtain a report, seller shall deliver such report within 3 days. So how do we know if the seller, whose responsibility is this now? Well, you would have filled that out in the RPA, hopefully. There is now a little fire section there. We can take a look at that as well. So, but we're at the point where the seller is filling this out. They're either unaware, they're aware, or they're aware and it's not in compliance. So it's going to be one of those. Section 3C we're on right now. Buyer and seller agreement regarding which party shall obtain compliance with applicable state or local defensible space requirements. So default. So the default status of this is buyer responsibility, no local ordinance. So that means it was a state, it falls into the state ordinance. Buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with the state defensible law within 1 year of close of escrow. So you don't need to do anything else at that point. You can say the property is subject to, actually that's the local, so it'd be is not, so it falls under the state. You could say the seller is unaware and not check any boxes, and then you can say 3C, by default, the seller, the buyer is going to take on the responsibility. So hopefully that makes sense. So, or the other options, the non-default options are buyer responsibility, local vegetation is in effect. So let's say this was marked yes up here, local compliance requirements, the property is, you're checking that box. And we're going to state that there is local vegetation management ordinance in effect, and the buyer is agreeing to take on the responsibility of rectifying it post-closing. Option 2, buyer responsibility, local vegetation management ordinance in effect, which does not require compliance as a result of the sale of a property. Buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with the state defensible law, defensible space law within 1 year. Other option, seller responsibility. There's 3 options here too. The local vegetation management is in effect, in which case the seller is going to need to provide the compliance certificate on basically all of these. So this was which requires compliance as a result of the sale of property. Local ordinance requires seller to obtain documentation. That may be true if the local ordinance is in effect. Seller responsibility, state or local compliance already complete. So they're stating they've already done it, and I'm providing you the certificate within 3 days after filling this out and sending it over to you. Seller responsibility, agreement to obtain compliance. Seller shall obtain documentation of compliance and deliver to buyer prior to the time of buyer's final verification of condition. That is by default within 5 days of close of escrow. So the seller needs to have this done within 5 days of closing escrow. Hopefully that clears that up a little bit. Let me see here. So we have one on my listing in Fallbrook. The fire department or another independent inspected the property 6 times, and each time asking for more things. is this now going to be the standard? I can't tell you. It's up to them, you know. Each individual inspector, I'm sure, has their checklist, and however strict they're gonna be with those checklists, um, I guess is up to them. I had one that was in a high fire and it wasn't too bad. They wanted some tree branches that were overhanging the house to be cut back. And there was a little bit of vegetation around the house, touching the house and stuff. Homeowner cleared it up. It was pretty easy. They came back out and gave us the certificate. It was really no problem, but I can't say it's going to be easy or hard, or you have to jump through hoops or not. I mean, every inspector within every local ordinance is going to be a little different. Um, Section 4 here, final inspection report disclosure. So seller has obtained a final inspection report addressing compliance with home, fire hardening or defensible space requirements as described in the government code. Seller has a copy of the report and it is attached. So you're filling this out. You're also including the certificate and sending it on over to the buyer. Or seller does not have a copy of the report and buyer may obtain a copy and there's probably going to be some sort of link, maybe a phone call where they can mail it. This is all going to be more than likely with local ordinances. So they'll need to find out where they can get a copy of that, the seller will. And they should know that because if they've had it inspected, then that inspector will instruct them on where they can obtain their certificate. They may not just hand it to them. They may not proactively email it to them or mail it to them. They may just say, hey, go to this link, put in the property address, you can pull it up there. So that would be the other option if there is, in fact, a compliance report that's on file. So that's basically it on the form. Hopefully that was more clear than it was confusing. The DSDT is attached to this form. So this is for the seller. If you are having a hard time explaining this, you can have them read this instead. Just follow steps 1, 2, 3. Have them go down this thing, fill it out, and then that will help them with filling out or knowing if they need to fill out this form. But really, section 1A and B of the FHDS is where you want to look. You're just asking yourself this question, or the homeowner is asking themselves this question, and this will determine on how or if they need to fill this out. So, what was the other? Oh, did you want to see the RPA? Oh, geez. There we go. Hopefully it doesn't log me out here. I can pull up the RPA real quick if you just want to see where it is when you're filling out an offer. I'm sure we've all noticed now. Geez, do I have one up here? I don't know if I have one pulled up. This over. Looks like I do have it up here. I'll just knock this out real quick. If you haven't seen it yet, or you're not sure what this little section is, that suddenly all of a sudden appeared, we'll pull this up real quick. All right, so now we're on the RPA package. So you're going to fill this out and you're going through, and we're right here on Q2 now in the grid, page 3 of the actual RPA, not the package, but the RPA itself. AB 38 requirements. Who is gonna take responsibility? Are you checking the buyer or the seller here, or both? And then you're gonna want this right here provided by my NHD. You're gonna want it to match up here as well. So whatever NHD report you're gonna be requesting, you're gonna want the same here to match up. So let's say you're writing this offer, you've checked the CAL FIRE site, it is in a high fire area. You don't know if the seller is in compliance or not, or there's going to be some sort of requirement, or you think there's going to be some sort of requirement, you're definitely going to want to fill out Q2 and get this negotiated up front, because if you leave this blank right here, NHD comes back, says it's in a high fire, and now the seller is like, well, I don't want to do it, I want you to do it. They send over, the FHDS form, and it says that it's going to be the buyer's responsibility. Well, now you're probably, maybe looking at a cancellation, because maybe that might spook the buyer. They don't want to take care of this post-closing. They don't want this responsibility, at least for that first year of home ownership. Obviously, they're going to need to do this at some point. So if you want the seller to take care of it ahead of time, especially you show up and this maybe looks like it's a real fire hazard, and it's maybe going to be expensive to clean up, you're going to want to check that the seller is going to take care of the AB 38 requirements. So hopefully that helps everybody. If there's no questions, I'd say it's right about 10 o'clock. We can go ahead and wrap up. So hopefully that helped everybody. If you have questions, obviously let me know, or I will post this presentation material in the, it's already in the online office. Again, transactional needs, AB 38 defensible space is the tab you want to go to, and you can get your fire resources there. Otherwise, this presentation will be in the Facebook group under the recording of this meeting. Again, thanks for attending. We will see you next week. And as always, let me know if you have any questions on anything, and I'll be around. All right. We'll talk to you later.